Okay, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I am Ken Chatur. I'm the Director of Research and Strategic Foresight at the Labor Market Information Council, and I'm joined today by LMIC's Senior Economic Advisor, Laura Adkins Hackett, to talk about Canada's labor market and helpful practices for navigating it. For those of you who are new to us, we are the Labor Market Information Council, or LMIC. We were launched in 2017 to address current and long-standing issues in Canada's fragmented and siloed labor market information system. LMIC works at the intersection of Canada's federal government and the provinces and territories. We also work with the Forum of Labor Market Ministers to identify and work on labor market information issues. At our core, we work to improve the timeliness, reliability, and accessibility of labor market information across Canada, and we try to foster collaboration across the Canadian landscape. By doing so, the goal is to better advance labor market information to empower Canadians to make better decisions about the world of work. Now, this is especially important because Canada's labor market information ecosystem is rapidly changing and quite dynamic. And we have data and contributions coming from a very wide range of sources, whether that's governments, research agencies, or increasingly private sector firms. Where LMIC fits into this is as a knowledge broker. We connect the disparate parts of our ecosystem to address and prioritize key challenges. We also try to not reinvent the wheel. We try to complement the authoritative research and data produced by organizations like Statistics Canada and academic researchers. And the goal of everything we do is to provide information and insights that are accessible and actionable for a wide range of audiences. So, it's just a temperature check. Thinking about the labor market today, what word comes to mind to all of you? Struggling, murky, competitive, challenging, complicated. I think I can tell challenging is the biggest word that's appearing here, and that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot going on in the labor market that can make it feel really difficult to navigate and make sense of. This is what we hear across the country, whether we're talking to folks like you or young people who are just entering the labor market. So hopefully, this is letting everyone know that they're not alone, and this is a shared challenge for many of us. So, thank you all so much for sharing that. And hopefully, one thing we can help with by the end of this is that murkiness and the confusing and complex nature of the labor market might feel a little bit less so by the end of this, or at the very least, you'll leave with some tools to help make it a little bit easier to understand. Thank you all so much for sharing about how you're feeling right now. Okay, let's go to the next question. How much would you say you know about labor market imbalances? So, do you know everything? You're omniscient? Do you know a lot, a little bit? Or are you like Jon Snow from Game of Thrones? You know nothing. And it's totally okay to be Jon Snow, by the way. Okay. Seeing a lot of folks are closer to knowing a little bit about that. And that makes a lot of sense. Labor market imbalances, as you will learn, are not necessarily intuitive from the get-go. So I think it makes a lot of sense that people feel this way. Okay, and we see a handful of people who know a lot, and we have no one who knows everything. So that's good. That means that there'll be a lot of room to learn today. Thank you all for sharing. That gives us a really good sense of where everyone's at today. And regardless of where you're joining us from and where you're at in terms of what you know about labor market imbalances, we really hope you learned something new today. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Laura.
Thanks, Ken. Before we start talking about labor market imbalances, it's important that we understand what we mean by the labor market. The labor market is a non-physical market for the exchange of labor. Just like any other market, it is a balance between supply and demand affected by price. And in the labor market, supply is the available labor, the number of workers looking for work or already holding a job. Demand is the available jobs, the vacancies and filled jobs. And wages are the price that shifts to help the supply and demand find an equilibrium. Traditionally, an equilibrium is when supply is equal to demand, meaning that if for a single good, the amount that individuals want to purchase is available, and the amount that producers want to sell is able to be cleared, so they would have no additional stock at that current price, meaning that the market is in balance and there's no additional supply or demand in that market. In the labor market, we do not expect or aspire to have a perfectly balanced market clearing equilibrium. It takes time to find or fill a job, and we want to see the labor market evolve. We want to have new people entering the labor market and new jobs being created. That means that the balance between supply and demand for the market is constantly shifting. And even if we had a labor market where supply and demand were perfectly balanced, We would expect to still see some imbalance in there through unemployment and vacancies, as not every single person is right for every job and vice versa. Now, there isn't just one Canadian labor market. Instead, it's made up of many smaller markets, each shaped by their own unique conditions, challenges, and opportunities. We often discuss the Canadian labor market as a whole, since national data is the most easily accessible and the national trends do give important and useful insights into the current state of the economy and worker experiences. But Canadian trends are an aggregate and do not represent every person's lived experiences. This is why we encourage everyone to consider your own personal labor market. Get a better understanding of the trends and data available that are related to you and those you support. To start identifying your own labor market, consider where you live, where you work, your demographics, your education, and what occupation and industry you work in. You may even want to include similar occupations and industries that have transferable skills in the definition of your labor market. Of course, it is difficult to get that data that granular, and we shouldn't expect it to fully represent a person's lived experiences. But understanding your personal labor market can help you identify what data is available and how it reflects you. The more granular data you can find, the more representative it is, allowing for better career planning and informed policy design. So we've now discussed what we mean by the labor market. I'm going to pass it back to Ken, who will give you an overview of imbalances and why they matter.
Thanks, Laura. So now that we defined what our labor market is, let's talk about labor market imbalances. So a labor market imbalance happens when labor supply and demand are out of sync. For example, think about when there are more jobs than available workers or more trained professionals than job openings. This mismatch can reduce the efficiency of the labor market and the economy as a whole. Now, as Laura mentioned, we don't expect to see a perfect balance. Imbalances are not as obvious as just seeing supply equaling demand, because we never really expect to see the labor market perfectly balanced, especially over an extended period of time. So let's use a real life example to kind of help make sense of what we just talked about. Imagine a labor market where everyone who wants to hire a plumber can do so, and plumbers can always find work at the going rate that they want. This is a labor market in a state of relative balance. But then that summer, along comes a construction boom. A bunch of condos and towers are about to be built. Suddenly, the demand for plumbers rises faster than the number of qualified available plumbers. Suddenly, wages start to rise because plumbers are in demand and at a premium. And in addition to that, some jobs just go unfilled because there aren't enough plumbers available. This is what we'll call a labor shortage, and it's one form of a labor market imbalance. Now, why does any of this matter? Um, and why should you care? Understanding imbalances can help us make sense of what's happening in our region, our occupation, or our sector or industry. It can help us inform policy development, post-secondary programming, and decision making. It can also give us information on which skills people need to develop when considering switching roles. So, from an ecosystem to an individual level, this does affect us. Now, a good way to understand why this is important is to see how labor market imbalances affect people and organizations. So let's first talk about job seekers and students, as well as their families. Understanding imbalances can help job seekers and students identify which career paths and skills are in demand and which educational or training paths might lead to better employment opportunities. For employers, labor shortages make hiring harder and can shape their wage expectations. Surpluses of workers may mean more applicants, but not all of them might have the skills that sufficiently match what employers are actually seeking. And for policymakers and practitioners and those who work at institutional levels, understanding where imbalances exist helps ensure that programs and policies are actually matching real world needs. So before we get on how to measure labor market imbalances, let's talk about the three high-level types of labor market imbalances that tend to manifest in the labor market. So first up are what we call labor shortages. This happens when the demand for workers is higher than the available supply. Often in the labor market, we will see this show up as periods of low unemployment and high job vacancy rates. And during a labor shortage, we find that workers might often have an easier time finding jobs. However, on the flip side of that, labor shortages can make it harder for employers to fill vacancies. Now, this situation typically leads to increased competition for employers seeking workers. And a labor shortage can result from a large increase in labor demand, like during a sector-specific hiring boom, like the example we just did with the plumbers, or perhaps an aging workforce where retiring workers outpace new workers in a field. Shortages can strengthen workers' bargaining power in negotiations in hiring conditions. Up next is what we call labor surpluses. This happens when more people are looking for work than there are jobs available. This makes it harder for job seekers to find work. Labor surpluses aren't always explicitly mentioned in media or policy discussions, so they can sometimes go a bit overlooked. And instead of hearing the term labor surplus in the media, you're probably more likely to hear about high unemployment rates, job competition, or underemployment. The situation typically leads to increased competition for each job opening and rising unemployment. A labor surplus can result from a large increase in labor supply or a drop in labor demand during an economic slowdown. Surpluses weaken workers' bargaining power in negotiations and hiring conditions. And this is especially important for new labor market entrants with less experience. So think about young people in particular. They can tend to be more affected by this type of shortage. And finally, let's talk about skill mismatches. When worker skills don't align with what employers need, even if the total number of jobs and workers appears balanced on paper, we can still have an imbalance. This is often referred to as a skills gap or skills shortage, and I'm sure many of you on this call have heard a lot of talk about this. It can slow hiring, it can constrain productivity, and it can also overlap with labor shortages or surpluses, which is why they can be sometimes a bit difficult to discern within the labor market information that we have. They reduce the efficiency of the labor market, and they can complicate efforts to identify and respond to imbalances. And again, these types of imbalance overlaps can be very tough to interpret in labor market data, which is why they're often such a source of discussion. Let's take a little breather to help some of these concepts sink in. So we've talked about the basics of labor market imbalances. So let's put this knowledge to test in some real world situations. So in our first situation, we have a dentist office in a small town, and they're finding it really hard to hire a dental hygienist. They're getting the normal number of applications who appear qualified on paper, but they just can't seem to find the right person for the job after going through the interview process. What kind of imbalance is most likely occurring here? Okay, this is awesome. Almost everyone got it. Skills mismatch. That is absolutely correct. So in this situation, it seemed like they had a balance of people applying, but they were just not getting the right people applying. That is classic skills mismatch. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so in this situation, we have a new graduate from a data science program. They're super excited to enter the labor market and start working, but they're finding that it is really difficult to land an interview. And even when they get job offers, the offer is well below what they were expecting. What kind of imbalance might be going on here? That's right. We have a labor surplus. Often in these situations, young people and new graduates are disproportionately affected because they have less experience. And they may also be dealing with a surplus of people with those credentials who are all applying for a smaller pool of jobs. Okay, let's go to the next question. So in our last situation, we have a construction company that wants to build an office tower. They set out to hire glaziers for their building, but not only are they struggling to find applicants, but the ones that do are insisting on a higher rate than they budgeted for. What type of balance is most likely to be occurring here? Yep, a labor shortage. Very similar to the example that we used at the above. Love seeing everyone grasping these concepts so well. That's awesome to see. And on that note, I'm going to hand things over to Laura to walk you through the imbalance indicators. And before we do that, I just want to note that we're able to show data where we can. In many instances, territorial data was not available. So if you don't see some of that data reflected, it's just because of the availability of the data. And please reach out to us if you'd like to find out about data for the territories, if that's something that you would like to find out more about. Okay, I'll pass it back to Laura.
Thanks, Ken. So now that we know what we mean by labor market imbalances, we can start to explore some indicators for identifying and understanding them. Since the labor market is not expected to have a perfect balance, it's useful to look to multiple indicators to understand the state of balance. Some indicators have a more direct relationship to imbalances, while others provide indirect insights. But they're still important to understand what is driving the labor market and how to navigate the current situation as an individual, organization, and community. There are many different data points you can look to, and today we're going to discuss just a few indicators that provide insight into the state and context of balancing the labor market. Depending on what you are looking to understand will determine which indicators make the most sense to look at individually or together. Our first indicator today is the unemployment rate, which tells us about the labor supply. The unemployment rate is one of the most discussed labor market and overall economic indicators. It generally appears to be pretty straightforward, but it can be more complicated than people give it credit. The unemployment itself is the number of people who are not working and have actively looked for work within the last month. Unemployment can be looked at as a level, but this is not as intuitive and is more difficult to compare across time or regions, which is why we typically focus on the rate. The unemployment rate is the share of the total labor force that are unemployed, and the labor force consists of anyone who's unemployed or employed. It does not include those who have chosen to not engage in the labor market for whatever reason. And we will touch a bit more on that later. The unemployment rate gives insight into how difficult it is to find a job. When the unemployment rate goes up, it indicates an increase in unmatched labor supply, suggesting a surplus. For context, a 5% unemployment rate can be interpreted as for every 100 people engaged in the labor market, 5 were not employed and were actively seeking work. Here we have some data about the unemployment rate in Canada, looking at both the current and historical unemployment rates. The chart shows the most recent unemployment rate for June of 2026, the rate from 1 year prior, as well as an average of the reported rates from 2021 to 2025, just to give some historical context. In Canada, the most recent unemployment rate for June was 6.5%. This is above that average unemployment rate reported over the last 5 years of 2021 to 2025, indicating unemployment has been increasing. Provincially, the most recent unemployment rates range from 5.4% in both Manitoba and Quebec to 8.2% in Newfoundland and Labrador. The June rate is lower than the same time last year for every province except Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, just once again highlighting the fact that things don't change at the same rate across the country and why it's so important to look at that granular piece. Our next indicator is the vacancy rate. This directly tells us about the unmet labor demand. The vacancy rate is the number of available vacancies as a share of total labor demand, which includes the vacant and filled positions. A job is vacant if it is unfilled or will soon be, and the employer is actively recruiting for a paid worker to fill the position. When the vacancy rate is high, it suggests that employers are having difficulty in finding workers, indicating a labor shortage or skills mismatch. If there's 1 month or quarter with high vacancy rates, it could also indicate something else is happening in the local economy, such as a large amount of newly created or vacated positions. And that's why it's important to not look at indicators in isolation, as there may be other factors at play that we could learn about through other indicators or even just looking at the trend over time. Similar to the unemployment rate, a 5% vacancy rate means that for every 100 jobs available, 5 of them remain unfilled. Here we have some data on the national and provincial vacancy rates, very similar to what we saw for the unemployment rate, though this data starts for April, as that's the most recent vacancy data. In April, the Canadian vacancy rate was 3.1%, which means for every 100 jobs, just over 3 were unfilled and looking for workers. Provincially, the rate ranged from 2.6 in Ontario to 3.7 in British Columbia. Across the board, the provinces had lower vacancy rates in April compared to that historical average from 2021 to 2025, suggesting the labor market has been tightening or shift towards a labor surplus, similar to what we saw with the unemployment rate. We can actually bring together the unemployment and vacancy data into a single indicator of imbalance through the unemployment to vacancy ratio. If you have space for only one indicator of labor market imbalances, this is the best one to get an overview. But without the details, you're missing what is driving that imbalance. So you need those details to make any real conclusions. The unemployment to vacancy ratio is simply the number of unemployed workers divided by the number of vacant positions, showing how many unemployed workers are available for every open position. If the ratio is 1, that means for every vacancy, there's a single unemployed person. Typically, the unemployment to vacancy ratio sits above 1. However, when the labor market loosens up, we do see it reach 1 or even below, and we've seen that in recent years. The higher the ratio, the more unemployed individuals are available per job vacancy, indicating more competition for the average job. And as we've said before, this does not mean that there's suitable labor available for each vacancy, as not every worker is a good match for every position, and vice versa. Once again, we can look to the current and historical data to see what's been happening. In April, Canada had an unemployment to vacancy ratio of 2.9. That means for every vacant position, there were almost 3 unemployed people seeking work. Provincially, the ratio ranged from 2.2 in British Columbia to 5.7 in Newfoundland and Labrador, which means there are approximately 3.5 more people available for every job opening in Newfoundland and Labrador compared to British Columbia. We do see that most provinces reported a higher ratio in April compared to the average historical ratio from 2021 to 2025, with the exception of New Brunswick, meaning that there are more workers available to compete for every vacancy. This indicates the labor market has been tightening and moving towards a labor surplus, consistent with what we've seen with our other indicators. One thing to remember is when you look only at that ratio, you can't say what is happening to either vacancies or unemployment, just the relationship between the two. For example, a decreasing ratio could be a decline in unemployment, but it can also represent an increase in vacancies or both. And that is why it's so important to look at the different pieces behind that indicator if you want a fulsome understanding of the current situation. The last chart showed some changing trends in the unemployment to vacancy ratio, but we missed out on the picture of how much has changed in recent years. So here we have a chart looking at the monthly Canadian unemployment to vacancy ratio starting in January of 2021. And as you can see, the labor market has shifted a few times over that period. Following COVID, we saw the labor market loosened up with a lower unemployment to vacancy ratio into 2022, meaning that there were fewer unemployed workers per open vacancy. During that period is when that ratio fell below 1. This is due to both an increase in vacancies and a decrease in unemployment. So for context, when the ratio was 1.3 in August of 2022, the unemployment was at 5.2% and vacancy was at 5.5. After 2022, the labor market began to tighten and the unemployment to vacancy ratio increased, reaching a high of 3.6 in August of 2025. This increase was driven by supply and demand changes, and in August of 2025, we saw unemployment increase to 7.1% and the vacancy rate decreased to 2.8, both rates diverging from what was reported in 2022. If we compare the ratio from these two periods, we see that there were about 2.5 more unemployed individuals seeking work for every vacancy in 2025 compared to 2022, increasing the competition for the average vacancy in Canada. We can extract even more information from unemployment and vacancy data if we look to the persistence of unemployment and vacancies through the long-term rates. So the long-term unemployment is an indicator of how sticky unemployment is, and long-term vacancies tells us the same on the demand side. Unemployment is considered long-term when it lasts for 27 or more weeks, and vacancies are considered long-term when they're open for 90 or more days. Long-term unemployment you would expect to go up when there's a labor surplus, as it's more difficult for people to find jobs, leading to longer periods of unemployment. Conversely, we expect the long-term vacancies to go up when the labor market loosens, as the firms face more competition for eligible candidates to fill their open positions. Each can be turned into a rate for comparison across jurisdiction and time. The rate is simply the share of unemployment or vacancies that are classified as long-term. Here we have the most recent data for both of our long-term rates. So in June, the long-term unemployment rate was 24% in Canada, which means about a quarter of unemployed workers had been unemployed for at least 27 weeks. Provincially, we saw that rate range from 16.9 in Prince Edward Island to 33.2 in Manitoba. In the first quarter of 2026, which is the most recent data for vacancy duration, we saw the long-term vacancy rate was 28%, meaning just over a quarter of vacancies had been open for at least 90 days. The provincial ratio ranged from 20.7 in Prince Edward Island to 41.4 in New Brunswick. Both the long-term unemployment and long-term vacancy rates are varied across the country, once again showing how there's different circumstances between the regions. One thing I also want to note is that there isn't a guaranteed relationship between long-term vacancy and long-term unemployment. What I mean by that is one doesn't necessarily go up when the other goes down, because there are factors that affect both the length of unemployment and vacancies. A good example of that would be seasonal changes in hiring, Because if you're going through a season where there's going to take longer for the hiring process, then you end up seeing both longer periods for vacancies and unemployment as people navigate that hiring process. So you may end up seeing both long-term vacancies and long-term unemployment increasing at the same time, regardless of imbalance. While vacancies and unemployment are clearly representative of imbalances, there are many other indicators that give us insight into the state of imbalance in the labor market. Today, I'm only going to touch on a couple, but there are many more out there. First, we have the participation rate. This is the number of people participating in the labor market as a share of the total working age population. The working age population includes anyone 15 and over, but you are only considered in the labor market if you are working or actively seeking work. The participation rate is an indicator of labor supply and gives us insight into the untapped labor supply. The participation rate is important for understanding how engaged the population is, and this is particularly useful when looking at subsets of the population to identify underrepresented or disengaged groups. A decreasing participation rate tells us that people are leaving the labor market for some reason. It could be that is an aging population with more people retiring, or workers are getting frustrated due to difficulty finding work and are choosing to leave the labor market until circumstances improve. The participation rate is really important to consider when there's a surprising change in unemployment, as unemployment only considers those in the labor market. If people are leaving the labor market due to frustration, then you would see the unemployment rate decline even if people are not finding work. Finding a job versus leaving the labor market are very different outcomes, and a good example of why we can't look at only one indicator, even that commonly reported unemployment rate. So in Canada, the most recent participation rate for June was 65%, which is pretty typical. This means for every 100 people 15 and over, 65 were actively engaged in the labor market. Provincially, we saw the rate range from 56% in Newfoundland and Labrador to 69.5% in Alberta. That means between those two provinces, for every 100 people 15 and over, Alberta had almost 14 additional people engaged in the labor market compared to Newfoundland and Labrador, showing quite a range in the participation of the population and that untapped potential labor supply. Our final indicator for today is going to be average hours worked. Hours worked gives us insight into the supply of labor as individuals choose the number of hours that they are willing to work, which is their supply to the labor market. The number of hours worked is generally agreed upon with one's employer, but people will choose their positions based on how the number of hours aligns with their willingness to work. And that can also shift depending on demand from the market and other factors. Typically, hours worked is presented as either the usual or actual hours worked in a week. Here we have the actual average hours worked, and this is the specific amount that they worked in the reference week, considering things like vacation, illness, and overtime based on the labor force survey. Hours worked gives us more detail on how much labor is being supplied by those employed, as not every worker provides the same amount of work. I think the most obvious way to consider this is by comparing full-time and part-time work. You may need 2 part-time workers to fill 1 full-time position, which would mean you'd have 2 jobs providing the same amount of labor supply as 1 full-time position. But even within full-time work, there is variation, and something like an increase in overtime can be used when firms are facing a labor shortage and not able to hire enough workers to meet their demand, putting more pressure on the current workforce. Hours worked can reveal hidden imbalances in the labor market, like underemployment or over-reliance on part-time workers or overtime. In Canada, we saw the average hours worked for June was about 37.6, which is consistent with June 2025. And provincially, we saw it range from 36.8 in Quebec to 39.9 in Prince Edward Island. Now that we've gone through some examples of labor market imbalance indicators, let's open up our Mentimeter again for a few quick questions on the indicators. So our first question is, which indicator provides insight into how difficult it is for employers to find workers in the current labor market? Of course, you can probably defend any of these, but choose the one that is the best example. If you had to choose only one indicator to talk about how difficult it is for employers, which indicator would you choose? Okay, it looks like we're seeing a lot of people go towards that vacancy rate, and that is correct. It is the vacancy rate. As the vacancy rate is telling us about how many the jobs that are open that employers are still trying to fill. So here we have the unemployment to vacancy ratio in your community has increased from 3 to 5. What could this change indicate? And for our responses, we have an increase in the number of unemployed individuals, a decrease in the job vacancies, that there are more job seekers competing for available jobs, or all of the above. Okay, it looks like a lot of people are leaning towards all of the above, and that is correct. It is a bit of a trick question, but as we discussed earlier, that ratio tells us about the relationship between supply and demand. And so we can see it change depending on both behavior in the supply or demand side, which means when we just know about that ratio change, we can't tell you exactly what is driving it. And our final question today. In your local labor market, there are 10,000 workers, of which 750 are unemployed. At the same time, local businesses report 500 job vacancies. What is the labor market imbalance in your local market? So for this, consider if it's a surplus or shortage, and then what would be the number of that imbalance based on these unemployment and vacancy rate numbers. It looks like a lot of us are leaning towards the labor surplus of 250 workers, and that is correct. It's a labor surplus because we have more unemployed workers than vacancies, and the difference is 250 between the two. So we've now gone through some examples of useful indicators for understanding labor market imbalances, but there are others that you can use. And we do include more examples of indicators and details on those indicators and these in our recently published guide, Using Labor Market Indicators to Understand Labor Market Imbalances. Earlier, we mentioned the concept of your own labor market. And while we've included regional breakdowns, I now want to touch on other examples of how indicators shift with a more granular breakdown. So just a reminder, some of the ways you may break out your own labor market include industry or occupation specific trends, demographic trends, educational trends, etc. These more granular looks are important for individuals to identify labor market outcomes that are relevant to themselves, and for policymakers to ensure that they are building policies that align with the intended population. First, we're going to look at the supply side. Here we have the demographic breakdowns for both the unemployment and participation rates. As you can see, there is variation between gender and age for both rates. Looking first to that unemployment rate, we see that youth have the highest rate of unemployment. This tells us that youth are having a harder time finding work compared to older workers. Now, this is not new. Youth historically have had higher rates of unemployment, but it does help us to better set expectations for young workers entering the labor market compared to only focusing on the overall unemployment rate. Now, one thing I just want to include here is that even within youth, if you break down the data more, you'll continue to see variation in those labor market outcomes between the early youth, those who are 15 to 19, and later youth, those that are 20 to 24. In June, the total youth unemployment rate was 12.7%. Sorry that that's not on the slide, but please bear with me. The rate for the later youth, again, those that are 20 to 24, was 9.4%. So that sits above the general population's unemployment rate, but not by as much, which means when we look to the early youth, again, those who are 15 to 19, their unemployment rate was 19.1%, which is a significant variation from the general population and that older youth cohort. And it's just so important to remember that even when you're looking at what feels like granular data, there still might be variation happening there. And I'm not saying you should find a way to get perfect data because it's not going to be possible, but you need to consider who's included in those data points so you can understand what is driving it and you can ask the right questions if things are not sitting the way you expect. And so you're best able to give the advice that is needed based on what is happening in that data. Now, looking to the participation rate, we can see that core-aged workers are significantly more likely to be engaged in the labor market compared to youth or mature workers. Breaking down the participation rate, we see which demographics are less engaged in the labor market, and that can be used to identify opportunities to engage more of the population in the labor market during a shortage. Policies and initiatives focused on increasing the participation rate can help address labor shortages by identifying underrepresented groups, allowing for targeted initiatives. Finally, we'll switch back to the demand side, and we're going to see here how vacancies vary across industries. As we talked about earlier, the overall vacancy rate in Canada was 3.1%, but when we look at industry-specific rates, we see it ranges from 1% in educational services to 5.1% in accommodation and food. That means for every 100 jobs in those two industries, there are 4 more job openings in accommodation and food services compared to educational services. That shows more opportunity for workers to find positions in accommodation and food services, though I'm not saying someone in educational services should look towards positions in accommodation and food services. That may not be the path that works for them, or they may not be qualified. But it's really important to remember this as It's a good reminder that applicants are facing different challenges and outcomes so that we can give them advice and help them understand what they are navigating independently. And when you work in a specific field or designing industry-specific policy, it is important to understand the unique trends to make the best informed decisions. So now that we've discussed the indicators and different ways to approach them, I'm going to pass it back to Ken to wrap up for the day.
Thank you so much, Laura, for walking us through all of that complex information and making it so understandable. Okay, so you might be thinking to yourself, oh, wouldn't it be great if all of this information was available somewhere for you, with all of those concepts fully explained, with the data for your province available for you to explore? Well, you are in luck because LMIC has a dashboard for that. So, to bring the work to life that we shared today, a lot of this, all of it was led by Laura, by the way. The dashboard was created by Vivian Lee, our senior economist. I just want to share and shout out how much Laura contributed to this work. We really loved what Laura put together and we wanted to bring it to life. So if you go on our website, you can find the labor market imbalances dashboard and you'll find the metrics and lots more there, as well as refreshers on the concepts and how to interpret them. The guides there too are also great complements to help you understand what you're looking at as well. You can download reports from the data in the dashboards as well, or just the data if you want to do your own analysis. We tried to make it as accessible and usable for you as we possibly could. So please check it out. Up next is our youth employment dashboard. We talked and alluded to youth throughout this presentation today. It is one of the most pertinent topics, so we made a dashboard dedicated just to youth employment. And we know that this is a highly pertinent topic for many people. You will also find additional guides and information about the metrics that are shared there. It's very customizable at various levels, including getting down to the provincial level. And again, we made these with the intention of providing information, not just data. So I encourage you to check it out. And finally, and last but not least, is our CJTD, or our Canadian Jobs Trends Dashboard, which is powered by Lightcast online job posting data. What's really neat about this dashboard is you can find information on that employer demand side, and you can get down to the census division level, including to the territories. And you can find information about in-demand skills, software skills, and even certifications that employers want. We know that job seekers often want specificity in the information in terms of what employers are looking for, and this dashboard is a great way to find that information down to your local level. It can tell you which jobs are in demand, how that's changing, and it can even give you a sense of how the composition of skills requested by employers is continue to change. And I will mention every single one of these dashboards are completely free, and you just need to sign up with your email to get access. Strongly recommend that you do if you're a data nerd or an I, or if you're just someone who wants to learn more.